Hello, and welcome to our week 8 lecture. This week, we're going to be diving in and really considering not only whose stories are being told on stage and what perspectives are being shared, but we're really going to start looking critically at how are people being represented and who gets to tell whose stories on stage. So, a little bit of vocabulary. Oop. To start off, today we're going to be covering some concepts such as the politics of representation, colorblind casting, color conscious or racially conscious casting, tokenism, and inclusion. And I will explain what each of those means in just a little bit. So, first off, the politics of representation. So, when I say politics here, I'm not talking about like Republican versus Democrat, liberal versus conservative, the way that we often talk about politics in the United States. What I'm talking about here is thinking to the original meaning in Greek of politics is of the people. So, really, what we're talking about when we talk about the politics of representation is how are people being represented? How are groups of people represented by perhaps a single character that we see on stage? And what does that character reflect about our attitudes about particular groups? So, the two major questions that we ask when we're thinking about the politics of representation are one, what does the portrayal mean for the audience in this social and political climate? So, if we are going to put on a production today, regardless of when it was written, what does it mean for the audience who is seeing the production? And second, does this portrayal reinforce, resist, or reimagine the status quo or our popular narratives about the people being represented on stage, particularly when we're talking about the portrayal of people of marginalized identities? So, this concept of politics of representation becomes really important when we are considering diversity in casting in the theater. And when it comes to casting, particularly when we're thinking about race, but this also applies to gender, disability, sexuality, etc. So there's two major approaches to casting in theatrical productions. We've got this idea of colorblind casting and color conscious or racially conscious casting. So first, colorblind casting is basically the idea that we don't necessarily give consideration to the race or ethnicity of the person playing the role when we are casting a show. Um, Sometimes, if we are considering this in other contexts, we also have gender blind casting. So, in this scenario, the roles are filled by actors who are would not usually have the opportunity to play them if we were to cast a show the way that it's traditionally been played. So, an example of this is in fall of 2018, OSU Theater did a production of Legally Blonde, the musical. Um, and while Elle Woods, our main character, is usually played by a white blonde woman, we used colorblind casting and cast Cindy Tran Nguyen as Elle. So we had an Asian American woman playing Elle Woods, which is not who we usually see playing that role. So some of the limitations of colorblind casting um, that have come up in the past few years, in particular, as the general mainstream discussion around race has been kind of ramping up, is that we've got a really high risk of tokenism. And what I mean by that is that we might have a single character played by a person of color, um, or it seems that the person is there specifically so that the production is more diverse, but there might not be a lot of thought behind that. There might not be playing a meaningful role in the production. Another thing that happens a lot with colorblind casting is that BIPOC actors are frequently cast in roles that frame them as other. So they might be the villain in a story. They might be cast as a non-human in a story or someone who is just generally outcast. And you see that visual difference in skin tone that adds extra layers to things in harmful ways, or they're often cast as subordinate somehow within the story. For example, a production including actors of color, but only casting them in the roles of maids and servants. This happens an extraordinary amount still, unfortunately. And the problem with this is that it can serve to reinforce really harmful narratives that already exist in our culture if it's not used thoughtfully. So that's where a lot of the pushback comes back with colorblind casting, is that there isn't always a lot of thought given to what different bodies mean on stage and whether we are challenging preconceived notions that the audience might have and that are circulating in our culture, or if we're just reinscribing those over and over again. So, on the other hand, in response to this, we have color conscious casting, which is also sometimes called um, race conscious casting, racially conscious casting. So the difference between the two is racially conscious casting or color conscious casting considers both the actors and the characters' race and ethnicity and the impact that they have on the story. And it's a very deep consideration of both of those things. It's really looking at the power dynamics both in the story and in society. So, very much an awareness of what is going on in our world, as well as what is going on in the world of the play, and how those influence each other, and how that's going to impact how the audience watches the play. Color conscious casting really encourages making choices which add layers of meaning to the story. So, to illustrate that, I want to talk you through a little bit of a couple of case studies for moments that color conscious casting has been used. The first one, I'm going to talk about a show that I myself directed here at OSU called Hot and Throbbing by Paula Vogel, which you will watch Indecent at the end of the semester, which was also written by Paula Vogel. So the story of Hot and Throbbing generally is, it's basically a story of a family um, and their relationships to each other. It's a story about domestic abuse and the kind of long impact that that can have between a mother and a daughter and how it messes with one's perception of reality. So basically how the story goes is we have Charlene. The mother is a writer. She supports her two kids, Calvin and Layla, by writing basically erotic fiction for women. Her ex-husband, Clyde, has a history of abuse with Charlene. He is fairly verbally and emotionally abusive to her. He has beaten her, hit her in the past, And Charlene has moved away at this point with her two kids. And kind of the inciting incident of the play is Clyde returns to their home and breaks in to try to get Charlene to take him back. And we see kind of their family dynamic play out. There's a lot of tension between Clyde and Calvin because Calvin has witnessed his father beating his mother, and is very protective of his mom because of that. And we have Layla, the daughter, who is kind of in the dark about all of it, has a very close relationship with Clyde, her father, and just wants him to come back and for her parents to get back together. So, as I was casting this show, I had my 4 actors that I was interested in casting. I liked them. They were available. They were interested in doing the show. So, the 2 roles that I was really considering for color conscious casting were the roles of Clyde and Calvin. So I had 2 actors. I had Kieran, a white man, and Tony, a black man, who were going to fill those 2 roles. And to talk through my decision making in how I decided to put who in which role, first I considered what the characters are like. We've got Clyde, who is honestly painted in kind of a pathetic light. He does have this history of violence about him, but at this point in the story, for the most part, he's portrayed as a very absent father figure. He's an alcoholic. He has no job. He's broke. He is coming back, it seems, to kind of mooch off of Charlene. Calvin is a kind of nerdy teenage boy. He is fascinated by stories and storytelling. He is really protective of his mom. And he and his father have some scenes of confrontation and tension in the show. So, with that context, I was really particularly thinking through the casting of Clyde. And I decided not to put Tony in that role, even though both of the actors were perfectly capable of playing the role. I had to consider from the point of view of the audience. Clyde, had I cast Tony, a black man, in that role, that would have been reinforcing a lot of really, really harmful cultural stereotypes that are statistically untrue about African Americans. There is this really widespread belief in absent fathers, and also we've got this stereotype of black men as violent. So I really didn't want to play into that with Clyde. That cultural stereotype isn't nearly as prevalent for white men. So as the audience would perceive that, Clyde So the other thing about Clyde is he's kind of the villain of the story. And I didn't want to cast my only actor of color in the role of the villain because we wouldn't have any sort of balance in there. So I ended up casting Tony in the role of Calvin, because I felt that that kind of undercut a lot of stereotypes that we have in the US about African Americans. Calvin is really bookish and nerdy at the same time as he's protective of his mom. but is kind of a smaller dude. He has a very strong emotional connection with her, and he's just overall painted as a pretty complex character. Another thing with the relationship between Clyde and Calvin is that part of the tension there visually could be that maybe an extra layer of the tension between them is that Calvin is not actually Clyde's son. He may be Charlene's son, perhaps. She had him by another father. Calvin has a lot of moments where he refuses to call Clyde dad. So there might be a bit of racism on Clyde's part. There might just be a bit of wanting to take control over Charlene, over Calvin, but having kind of this rift. So it creates a lot of different layers of complication in there if we consider who is playing what role in terms of race in this show. So another example in the professional theater. So our second case study is a musical called Little Shop of Horrors. We'll be looking at two videos of the same song, the same scene, one from the movie adaptation from 1986, one from a production from 2019. So I'll let you read a little bit about what the director had to say about his casting choices, what the actors had to say about it, and also you'll have a chance to watch the two videos to kind of see what are the differences in how these characters are being portrayed, what layers of meaning are added when different people of different races and different gender identities play these same roles.